Using only its first hour as a basis, it's challenging to describe what 𝐦𝐤𝐬𝐷 actually is. You awake as a bleary-eyed humanoid creature, young and vulnerable, born into a strange world that feels cold and seemingly devoid of life, at least at first. We don't learn much about this world in the game's first hour, and we're not much better informed by the time the credits roll. The story exists, but for better or worse is dialogue-free and minimalist in its approach, letting its world and the player's interpretation of it do the talking. But story isn't the main draw in 𝐦𝐤𝐬𝐷, and I don't think it was intended to be. While the first hour learning the game's mechanics and taking in its world made me curious where it was headed, ultimately it's a game that, at least in theory, I've always wanted and never quite gotten. 𝐦𝐤𝐬𝐷 is a Souls-like game for people who don't like Souls-like games. It's full of flashy, beautifully animated boss fights taking place in huge, gorgeous worlds with emphasis on tight, parry-focused melee combat. This is all par for the course in this subgenre, but for those unacquainted, there's usually a heavy element of obtuse and challenging game design that goes with it. These less friendly elements, which fans of games like Dark Souls, Elden Ring, or Nioh tend to enjoy, have an element of masochism that's more for some people than others, and I'm not what you'd consider some people. But this rough side of the Souls-like genre is completely absent from 𝐦𝐤𝐬𝐷. Checkpoints are plentiful, your health bar refills after every combat encounter. There are no bonfires that reset enemies in this environment. Enemy attacks are impactful, but never dare to eat up half your health bar in one go. Some of the obtuse nature remains in its storytelling, but this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as I personally prefer no dialogue to mediocre dialogue, and felt that the cutscenes and attempts at world building were never too intriguing, but also never overstayed their welcome. From what I could gather, some of your fellow two-legged animal friends have been corrupted into hulking monstrous beasts. Each level of the game is you hunting down one of these giant monsters, fighting some smaller enemies along the way, and exploring for upgrade material. Before getting too far though, it's worth elaborating on how it feels to play 𝐦𝐤𝐬𝐷, and really, I'd most closely describe it as a flashy, colorful counterpart to 𝐸𝐴𝐵𝐸 Shadows Die Twice, without the part where the game functionally tells you to go fuck yourself every minute or two. Brief disclaimer, 𝐸𝐴𝐵𝐸 is the only Souls-like I've ever actually enjoyed, even though playing it entailed a level of stress equivalent to using a flagpole as a dildo. It's a game I love to hate and hate to love, and frankly I appreciate that 𝐦𝐤𝐬𝐷 gives me a take on it that doesn't make my eyes bleed from forgetting to blink. Accordingly, 𝐦𝐤𝐬𝐷 is a game about traversing through pretty environments punctuated by quick bouts of intense combat that lives or dies by the art of the parry. An aggressive offense gets you virtually nowhere in this game, and only through reading enemy movements and hitting the right bumper, which parries an incoming attack when timed right, will you meaningfully progress through the battle. Doing so correctly fills a meter at the bottom of the screen that might as well be 𝐸𝐴𝐵𝐸's posture meter. While enemies have their own health bars, this energy meter is a measure of how far you are through that combat encounter, which can include more than one enemy at once. Parry well and fill it up, and the left trigger will unleash a finishing move that absorbs your opponent's essence to use for power-ups later, ending combat and refilling your health. 𝐦𝐤𝐬𝐷's color switching mechanic adds a little more depth to this though. Every enemy will choreograph a color before they land a hit, either blue, orange, or purple. The energy meter will fill and your health will regenerate only if you match that color before parrying. It's here though that I do wish there were some alternate control schemes. As it stands, the left bumper switches colors and the right bumper parries, but given only two colors can be parried, a third purple color is unblockable and must be dodged or interrupted, it would have been nice to parry one color with one bumper and one color with the other. On paper it seems like that would be more natural, but I got used to the color switching approach quickly. Enemies are aggressive enough to require careful attention, but the generous health refills and regularly saved progress makes it easier than it at first seems. Killing enemies and bosses will also give you upgrade points that can be used to enhance your abilities to buy new ones, and these can definitely feel impactful and make fighting the optional enemies worthwhile. While the smaller enemies in the game are fun to fight and keep you on your toes with varied movesets, the same designs repeat frequently, and some more variety would have been welcome. But either way, it's the boss fights that really steal the show here. As I mentioned, each level has you fighting through smaller, though still sizable, enemies before facing off with a massive creature, usually more than once. I found the variation in these bosses fascinating, and not just from a gameplay perspective. Visually, each one is exuberantly animated with their own personality. One of them clearly wants you to leave them alone, shooing at you periodically and trying to kick you away. Another seems to not even be angry at first, and rather than explicitly attacking, usually just curiously swats at you like a giant bored chimp, occasionally getting distracted by wildlife in the arena he wants to run over and play with. Their expressive nature makes each encounter memorable, beautifully supplementing the varied movesets and bombastic visuals. They're always fun to fight too, with interesting twists in the movesets that keep you on your toes. When you fill your energy meter at last, hitting the left trigger starts a sequence of button prompts that result in spectacular twirls of the camera and beautiful explosions of light and color. Overall, 𝐦𝐤𝐬𝐷's presentation can be something to behold. The music is great, which is no surprise coming from one of the composers behind Journey and 𝐦𝐤𝐤𝐿. Peaceful melodies during traversal give way to rousing battle music that always sets the scene well. The world, while large and mostly empty outside of the main hubs, is constantly giving you something great to look at, whether a distant vista or a field full of colorful grass dancing in the breeze. Don't get me wrong though, this game is no technical showpiece, but is elevated by fantastic art direction and great animation. The technical side is not quite as impressive. Visual effects can look great as you clash in midair and get tossed across the playfield by bosses, but textures around each environment can be blocky and lacking detail, almost as if the game was aiming for a low poly look without ever truly committing to it. Some environments, especially early on in the game, consisted of rocks and cliff faces that just looked plain ugly, which was in stark contrast to much of the rest of it. Bafflingly though, performance can sometimes struggle. It kept very smooth during combat, but especially when traversing into new areas, it can tend to stutter. While the drops felt like no big deal, on some rigs it could be more distracting, so I'd be careful to ensure you meet the requirements. The game also crashed a couple of times, one time forcing me to do a hard reset on my PC, so stability needs some work. Unfortunately, for those looking to play on Steam Deck, I have a hard time recommending it unless you're willing to take some major visual and performance compromises. The first thing Streetlights did when I launched was crash my entire Steam Deck and force it to reboot, which is about as good a first impression as shitting in my lap and running away. You can run it via Proton, but even then and with FSR active, the best I could get was 30 to 40 FPS on a mix of low and medium settings. Technically playable, but pretty ugly and not as responsive as I'd like. Now, I need to bring up an obvious flaw that even fellow critics of Souls-likes may agree with. Streetlights is really easy. After I got to grips with the mechanics, the first half of the game or so was an absolute breeze. That's not to say the enemies don't put up a fight, you really have to pay attention to their attacks and switch colors accordingly, but the generous parry window and full health refills threaten to trivialize the difficulty more often than not. Thankfully it does ramp up a bit closer to the end, introducing enemies and bosses with trickier movesets, but I would say it never quite gets past the baby's first Souls-like difficulty level, and by the time I finished, I felt like it could have pushed back a bit more. But this end comes a lot sooner than you might think. Regardless of your skill with games like this, unfortunately you're in for a pretty short ride. I wouldn't say I rushed through Streetlights, and even so, I saw the credits roll right around the 4-hour mark. I'm not one to normally complain about games being too short, as I feel many games have quite the opposite problem these days, but Streetlights ends just as the difficulty is starting to feel right, and I couldn't help but be disappointed that it ran out of ideas so quickly. Streetlights isn't perfect, but I had a great time with it. It fulfills an interesting niche by having tight parry-focused combat without cranking the difficulty to ridiculous levels. It seems to take some Souls-like inspiration, but make it both far more accessible and mostly stunning to look at. Something I wish more of these games would do. Maybe we could have a Souls-light genre spin-off. I do think its short length does itself a disservice, and is something to be aware of if you need a game to last a while. Hopefully some more content is patched in to make it feel a little more meaty, but for how long it lasts, it sure makes a hell of an impression.
Thank you so much for supporting clickbait-free independent content here on YouTube. Remember to hit the like button and subscribe to help us bring a voice to the voiceless ones in gaming, and be sure to check out patreon.com/IDreamOfIndieGames, where we can together defeat the gaming echo chamber.